Thanks for tuning in to Gin and Tantra, Spirituality with a Twist. Today you have Daniel with you. Eric has a little bit of time off, R&R, if you will, with his family. So we're bringing in some different people, friends of the show, if you will, talking about some, interesting things. We have Mary Kay with us today. Mary Kay, hello. It's been a
Hi.
while. I think you were on here probably about a year ago.
Was it that long?
Yeah, or and you guys were talking about spirits and
Oh yeah, it was Samhain. It was last year's Samhain.
yeah, it was last year. So I guess it's apropos that you're here again at the return of the sun time. So we are going to have, some discussion probably about Yule, right? In particular, the sort of, quote unquote pagan holiday, which, the more that I hear that word, the less that I like it, actually. I could say maybe more traditional observation of the winter solstice, perhaps, is a better way of describing it.
Mm.
And, given that, you and I have had some recent discussions about this and observing it as a holiday, as a celebration, as an, observed time of year, there is so much that is, I think, in our kind of like everyday lexicon of holiday observation or understanding, awareness, maybe, that people don't understand. They haven't really dove into it. So, people hear like Yule log or Yule tide, but I know for me, up until recently, I've never looked into what Yule actually is.
Mm.
So as we've been having these discussions, it's been a fun little research experiment to kind of go into it and illuminate myself again for all the things that have been here for far longer than I've been aware of them, which is so much more than I'm probably even conscious of, that I thought it would be nice to bring it to our little troop here. So yeah, I wanted to give you the floor. Like, let's start very, very broad, very, very broad here. What is Yule?
Before I do that, let me say something about the word pagan,
Yes.
because I was thinking about it while I was sort of preparing. You know me. I
Yeah.
thought, oh my God, he was going to ask me these questions. I have to make sure I know the definition of every word and da 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 da.
Oh
It was
yeah.
fun. I listened to a bunch of different people talk about it, and some of them were sort of annoyingly fluffy, and some were. It was fun. I learned some neat stuff I didn't know, and I've been doing Yule for 40 years. Anyway, the word pagan was a Roman word,
Yeah.
and I believe it comes from Latin paganus, which and anybody who speaks Latin, forgive me if that's incorrect. And it just basically means rural. And so it was applied by the Romans to people whose religious practices were what we might call the folk practices.
Mm.
As opposed to sort of the highfalutin Zeus, Apollo, Athena, big temples,
Yeah.
lots of pomp and circumstance. So in my mind, the folk traditions are probably a lot older. And then that word gets turned into the word heathen under the influence of the Christians. Heathen comes from the word heath. And so it actually just means the people who live out in the heath, i.e., the countryside. So
Mm-hmm.
once again, it's the rural folk religious traditions. And then the Christians added to that those who were not members of, wait for it, the army of Christ. And so,
Mm.
so there, when we think of pagan, we tend to think of the Romans or something, but it's ironic that we do that because, and the Christians call the Romans pagans, but the Romans, the highfalutin Romans who were actually in the major, city centers, would not have liked to be called pagans because
Correct.
it would have been insulting to them. So if you identify with sort of nature and the countryside and simple life and all that stuff that probably a lot of us do kind of at least long after, then being called a pagan turns out not to be such a terrible thing after all. But I agree with you, because when people use that term, I think, well, which pagans are you talking about? Because there were pagans who did sacrifice babies. You know what I mean? That actually, that kind of icky stuff happened if what you're talking about is polytheistic religious practices. So, there's every kind of quote unquote pagan. These days, I tend to use the term earth-based religions, which also has its problems because, it wasn't like they didn't care about the sky. Anyway, just wanted to comment on the word pagan since I'd been thinking about it anyway.
Yeah, no, that's cool. And I think the way, I mean, I don't, you could tell me how it sounded to you, but as you're explaining it, it almost sounds like pagan can be maybe synonymous with the word rural.
Yeah, exactly.
You
And
know,
it's,
the how there's like a divide between like city and rural, and you're like, oh,
yeah.
they're rural, they're country, you
And
know.
that division turns out to be historically very important because I wrote my thesis on medical on why medical historiography was so poorly done. And one of the reasons it was done poorly is that academics want to study medicine as it occurred in the urban areas by literate men. That's what they care about. But that's not where the majority of medicine occurred. The majority of medicine occurred in the countryside by illiterate women, which of course we don't care about because they're women and they don't know how to read. And so this division of the kind of rural bumpkins that we don't take seriously, that don't know what they're doing, that are kind of stupid, goes on to this very moment. We talk about people who live in the country as rednecks and stuff. So that division of urban people, and I would say it's being reflected in the country right now, because you have this division about people that we think of as the red states and the blue states. And we think of the red states as full of ignorant peasants from the countryside who are not as smart or educated, and then us urban elite guys, and we're so smart. And I'm not saying there's no validity to that, but it's such a simplification,
Yeah,
and it certainly doesn't facilitate conversation much.
correct.
Oddly, people who you're thinking of as stupid don't want to talk to you much, right? They don't want to talk to you or converse with you. And I ran into that when I was in the South, is that people thought that Northerners thought that they were stupid, ignorant, inbred morons. And most people, when you say that from the North, will say, well, aren't they? You know, because they think it's funny. And I'm just saying that if we want to actually converse with people, we might not want to start from that kind
Sure.
of point. But it's a very old point, is
Right.
the point of what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, carry on. What is Yule? Oh, okay. What is Yule? It's an interesting thing because when you try to look up Yule, it turns out that nobody's quite certain where the term Yule comes from.
Yes.
That's weird, right? Except that it's one of Odin's names was Yulner, and Yule seems to be from a Norse word, or at least a Northern Anglo-Saxony word that meant the period of time that was basically December and January. And so calling Odin Yulner, he had many names because he was a shapeshifter, many forms, was sort of to call him the maker of Yule, or the Yuler, the person who makes Yule happen, which is funny because he's not particularly a god of winter. He's a god of anything that he wants to be. So that's about it. That's where we know this word from. And in fact, the term Yule as a particular holiday seems to have come to the fore a lot more under the influence of Christianity, which is very odd. And so it sort of comes to be a thing in contradistinction to Christianity, to Christmas. But that said, it's highly likely from the sources that the Norse people, just like everybody else in the whole wide world, did acknowledge the winter solstice and did do special things on it. So even though it may not have been called Yule, the idea, there's my favorite line in one of the Norse written sources is Yule continues until the ale runs out, which I quite like. And then Saturnalia, which is around the same time that's the Roman festival, was again, there was a lot of drinking and carrying on, and also role reversals. So servants were supposed to be served by their masters and so forth. So the idea of Yule as a or this winter solstice time is as a carry-on, a time a time of excess. We do things to excess. We drink to excess. We eat to excess. We give each other presents. We sing. We dance. I think that's quite widespread, no matter what it's called. And I think that the interesting thing from the point of view of Samhain and shamanic practice, is that it harks back to very ancient things. This obsession with the solstice, which we can talk about more later, is very ancient and predates everything. And everybody is obsessed with it, everybody, including the Christians. We can talk about that also. So whether or not we call it Yule or we just call it the winter festival of the solstice, it's a very, very ancient practice. So that's Yule.
Nice.
It's an old practice of fun and excess in the dead of winter. So that's a little short definition.
No, that's great. No, that works. And so then, sort of, I guess we'll just sort of move forward with it then. Since it's an observation of the winter solstice, let's continue. Let's continue there. So winter solstice, right? Observed generally around December 21st, 20th, 21st. Sometimes the day will change a little bit based on the lunar calendar and where we are in particular. But speak a little bit about this if you would, and then we can kind of,
Sure. Well, so probably everybody knows this, but just as a review,
yes,
there are two solstices. One is in summer around June 21st, somewhere in there, 22nd, 23rd, and one in the winter, the dates you just mentioned. And the point of those 2 days from an astronomical point of view is that in summer you have the longest day of the year, and in the winter you have the longest night of the year. And that has to do with where the Earth is on its travels around the sun, because the Earth is, of course, tilted on its axis. So when it's at one part of its turn, it's turned away from the northern hemisphere. And we should talk about northern, southern. It's tipped away from the Earth, and that's when it's darker. And in another one, it's tipped toward the sun, excuse me. When it's tipped toward the sun, you have more light and longer days. The reason I want to just point out, speaking of northern to southern prejudices, that the opposite is true in the southern hemisphere. So currently they are having their summer solstice, which is weird when you think about it. I mean, it's just so hard to think about that. Like for them, this is going to be the longest day, and it's just strange. And then, of course, the equinoxes are when the summer, the day and the night are of equal length, and there's one in spring and one in fall. So that's the sort of astronomical basis to it. But that leads us to another whole question, which I won't go into until if you want me to, which is, why in the hell have people been so obsessed with the solstices? And we can talk about this, but we're talking about thousands of years of obsession. And we've been talking about this in my house. Like, what the heck is up with this solstice stuff? So carry on with your questions, and maybe we'll come back.
I think that's the right thing to know. So, why is it? And, I definitely, we're going to discuss it, but I think something that people forget is that the beings on Earth are heliocentric.
Yes.
And have been since the beginning, because without the sun, there is no life.
Yes.
And so the observation of that seems, I don't know, so obvious. Like if you were looking for something to worship or something to be thankful for or thankful to, if we believe it's a being, right?
Yes.
Then there is nothing else.
Yeah.
It's the sun.
Yep.
It's the sun, your warmth, your crops, your night, your day. I mean, everything is based around our planet revolving around. And now, as we know, gravity and the closeness to this atmosphere, all the other things, it's the sun and the sun and the sun.
And the sun.
Right.
And without it, if the sun disappeared tomorrow, we'd be dead in 5 seconds. We'd all be dead immediately because our atmosphere would go away. We would not be able to breathe. Let's just start there. Never mind that we would freeze to death instantly. So it's absolutely true that it's this thing that we take for granted, especially now, without which we would not exist. And we have the lucky happenstance that we are exactly the right distance from the sun to give us the kind of life we have.
Hmm.
I mean, no offense to Mars and the other planets, I'm sure they have their own beauty, but they don't have people and they don't have animals. Now, they may have bacteria. I know we're still discussing all that. And again, I think Mars is kind of beautiful when I've seen, close up pictures of it, but I'm not sure I'd want to live there. For one thing, I couldn't because of the temperatures and so forth. So that's the other thing, is it's not only the sun. So it's not just an individual thing. It's that the relationship between the earth and the sun is kind of wonderful and special, because
Hmm.
we are exactly this right amount of distance to keep ourselves warm without burning up or without freezing. So it's pretty cool. It's actually,
Hmm.
but it's easy to, especially for modern people, to forget that, I think.
Yeah.
So at
And
least for me.
we've also, fortunately or unfortunately, agriculture is relegated to like outside life,
Yeah,
especially if you're, relatively suburban.
right.
That
By the pagans, by the
by the
pagans.
pagans, right? That the pagans are doing all the farm, but really, it's less than 2% of the population has anything to do with farming. Most
Right,
people, the only thing they know is a farmer's market. You
right.
know, other than that, it's like you go to the grocery store, there's your food, it's here. It doesn't matter what season it is. There's blueberries even in the dead of winter. You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
um, but this removal of from agriculture and even from shifting produce,
yeah.
right? I mean, what people tell that the winter is coming? Why? Because pumpkin spice is back. You know what I'm saying? Like, pumpkin
Or like
spice.
today, I couldn't get pineapple juice
Yeah.
because it's not in season. I was very irritated. It's that kind of thing. Yeah, it's that
But
commodity thing.
it could commodity thing. So like I think that because of that, we have sort of, I mean, lost connection with the comings and go the natural comings and goings of nature on one level. But then because we are further away from it, we don't really see how the sun affects the environment, because I turn the light off, I turn
Yep,
the light
yep,
on,
yep,
we're expected to produce no matter, what time of the year it is. We don't
yep.
change our habits.
Right,
So it seems the seasons are almost like an annoyance on some level, depending on where you live, for most people,
right.
as opposed to like an awareness of literally where we are in space, you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
this idea of passing of seasons as a marking of a passing of time, and what it means to celebrate that we're still here. Oh, the
yeah,
sun is returning. Yay. Like
yeah,
that's
yeah,
good. We
yeah.
want that.
Well, and as you say, I was just saying to someone yesterday, when you live in a city, it's very hard to see where the sun is. So I
Mm.
went online yesterday in sort of preparation for this, and you can go on YouTube. It's kind of fun to do this, and they'll have a split screen. And on one side, they'll show you the winter solstice sun, it obviously in time lapse. And on the other side, they'll show you the summer solstice
Oh, that's
sun
cool.
in time lapse. So for what would be 24 hours takes, a few minutes. And and I thought, oh my God. I mean, I knew that was true. And of course, it stays dark on the winter side way longer because it takes so much longer for the sun to rise, quote unquote, rise. And on the other side, it's light outside very quickly. But also where the sun was so high on the summer solstice side of the screen that I couldn't see it. It was
Mm.
off screen. Whereas on the winter side, it was way low on the horizon. Now, I thought, I don't see the horizon.
Right.
Maybe if you're rich enough to live on Lakeshore Drive, you get to see the sunrise, but I don't see the sunrise because there is no horizon around me.
Mm.
So I think that's and as you say, the seasons are almost like an annoyance, or oh my God, it's going to snow, and
Mm.
um I've never actually, I don't like summer, so because it's too hot. I don't like being hot,
Mm.
but I think it's really true that the lights on, lights off thing. Years ago, I had this Unitarian minister who was a friend of mine, and she was talking about going to a winter solstice celebration.
Mm.
And she said she walked in and they all sat around, and the host turned off the lights so that it was dark in the room. And the minister's name was Mary Nadavant. She said, and I thought to myself, oh, yeah, okay, great. I get it. It's dark and we're experiencing the dark. she thought it was going to go on for like, 3 minutes or a minute or 2 minutes or something, but she didn't turn the lights on.
Mm.
She just left them off for a long time. And Mary said after about 15 minutes, she was like, turn the freaking lights on.
Yeah.
And what the woman was trying to do was give people the experience of what the dark of the year
Right.
was when you did not have lights
Right.
that just went on and off. And she said it was very profound. She got very anxious, very kind of freaked out. She just
Mhm.
wanted her to turn those lights back on. Not to mention the fact that it got cold and that people didn't leave their houses as much. So the
Mhm.
other piece, aside from light, is central heating. Like if
Mhm.
you've never been to a country, I have, where there are places that do not have central heating, um, it's the cold gets in your bones. And by
Mm.
God, if you're not sitting right next to the fire during those seasons, you can get very cold
Mm.
in a way, even though it's only 40 degrees outside, if it's damp like it is in Ireland and England, which is where a lot of these, and Northern Europe, where a lot of the celebrations we're used to occur. They occur everywhere, but the ones we know about and are used to, you're talking about a place where the winter you were really struggling with staying warm
Yeah.
all the through the entire season. You were dealing with lack of light and you didn't go out as much because why? Well, you don't have a car that you can sit in and turn the heat on. So it's not that easy to keep a carriage warm. You can do
Right.
it. You can put a heater in there. So people tended to stay home. So
Mm.
they did not see their friends as much. They did because people they didn't have television and all that. So the way you entertain yourself is you get up. This was true in Ireland up till television took over the culture, is that people got up after their chores are done and they walked to their neighbors' houses. But not in the dead of winter, you didn't, because it was pouring rain if it's Ireland, or it was snowing if it was, Norway or whatever. And so you had to stay home a lot. So when you add the thing of that, you cannot make it be light easily.
Mhm.
Candles are great and all, but they're not going to fight the dark
No.
easily. It's going to be cold and you have to stay near the fire to stay warm, and you can't go out as much.
Mm.
Then you're started, and if you can create an sort of pseudo environment where you might be able to experience that a little, then you really get what winter is
Mm.
and why the nights getting longer and longer and longer. Now I love this time of year. I I love I love sitting near the fire. I think you just get under the covers and wrap up. I don't mind being cold. But many people do not feel that way.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think you're also dealing with a period of time. This is my guess, this is my hypothesis, is that we have a significant portion of the human population that gets very sad and down when it's dark out,
Yeah.
right?
Oh yeah.
That's not new. I'll bet that's been part of us since forever.
Sure.
So then Yule, or whatever we want to call this time of year, becomes way more understandable because it's about let's venture out of our houses
Yeah.
anyway. Let's go to our friends' houses. Let's be noisy. Let's light a fire. Let's have it go all night long. Let's do things to fight off this kind of feeling of God, it's awful damn dark out here.
Mhm.
Plus, when you put a lot of people in a room, guess what happens? It gets warmer.
Right.
Body heat is a great heat source. So I think then that my idea about why this season looks the way it does is that it's about trying to cheer people up
Mhm.
because it is the cheeriest of all the holidays. It's the one where it's all about eat, drink, and be merry. So that's my feeling about a piece of at least the folk obsession with it,
Yeah.
is that it speaks to a very real need that people have at this time of year to
Mhm.
be reminded of, no, it's going to be okay. The light's coming back,
Right.
the sun will come up. Because this idea that anthropologists say the dumbest shit sometimes, they say things like, people were worried the sun wouldn't return. That's dumb. That's just dumb. People knew the sun was going to return. People were not stupid. They knew the sun was going to return because it always did. So I don't think they thought the sun wouldn't return or that they had to beg the sun to return. They knew the sun was going to return. They just wanted it to hurry up.
Mm,
They wanted in the meantime to try to feel better because yeah, this is the longest night and the light is going to increase, but it's going to take its time about it.
right.
We are now facing the hardest months for most people, which
Mhm.
are December and January.
In the Northern
Those
Hemisphere.
in the northern hemisphere, correct. And so I tried to research, but of course, I don't know, the internet was made by people in the north, so I couldn't find it out. But I wondered if do people down south get sad during when we're having summer solstice?
I don't
And do
know.
they have celebrations that are all about let's eat, drink, and be merry? That would be a really interesting question. If anybody knows anything about that, I'd
Yeah.
love to hear about that.
Yeah. If we have some, I know we do have international listeners for sure. Um, I think we do have some people in Australia who listen, but
Yeah,
if you are outside of really the US or Europe, or even if you're in Europe, it's okay. But if particularly outside of the US, if if you have any kind of experience with this, or you have family or friends who live, below the equator,
yeah, be interesting to know.
and not just below the equator, but below like that 10-degree latitude line, where you're outside of that sun zone where it's always warm, basically,
Right.
in order to have the seasons, definitely hit me up. Send me an email at ginandtantra@gmail.com. It's interesting to me.
And the other piece would be that the seasons were boring. That is, I mean, when you're a farmer, there's only so much repair of your equipment you can do,
Right.
right? Because that's what they did, a lot of that, and they planned their crops and all that stuff. But for people who are very extroverted and need others to be happy, I'm sure that it got boring. I mean, how much embroidery and
Right.
reading can you do
Right.
before you're starting to go, okay, I'm getting a little stir crazy here.
Hmm.
So, but having said all this, I think that it is that we are talking now about I'm just going to keep returning to this word. Obviously, we're talking about the pagans, that is,
Yeah.
the heathens, the
Mhm.
people out in the countryside. That doesn't really get on to why Stonehenge exists. Why does Newgrange exist? Why do the pyramids exist? Because you can cheer yourself up at the winter solstice without picking up 50-ton rocks and moving them hundreds of miles, right?
Right.
So there's some other level of this which we can also discuss that is a whole other level of why people are so obsessed with the solstices worldwide there. Because if you go on, I did this so you all can do it. If you go on and you put in world archaeoastronomy sites, Wikipedia has a list of them by country, and they're everywhere. Now, they're not equally distributed
Mm.
every place. So an archaeoastronomy site is a site in which it's relatively evident, and they're graded by 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 being we're certain it's has to do with astronomy, and 1 is maybe we're not so sure. So Stonehenge would be a 4. Newgrange is a 4. The pyramids are 4. That means we have no doubt that these were definitely about astronomical calculation. And then
Hmm.
there are others, but they are everywhere in the world. And so that's another whole level that I think we could talk about, which is not the folk level, because the folk don't move 50-ton rocks around. The folk work hard as it is, and they don't want to do stupid stuff.
Mm.
I mean, that's the question, is why would anybody build Stonehenge? It's crazy.
Well, before we go there, let's talk a little bit about the winter solstice celebration,
Yes,
and maybe analog to Christmas Eve,
yeah,
tales of, the sun returning, right? SON or the SUN, depending on
right,
what
right.
you're interested in. I think, and then we can maybe peel off and do
Sure,
that.
sure. Um, so there for a long time I have said um that the Christians stole everything they have. And part of me is just being hostile because there's so many things to be hostile about when it comes to that religion. However, not to say that I understand there are great Christians and all, but the history is bad. Anyway, but it's turning out to be that that's just stupid and simplistic. It's much more that everybody has their celebrations at this time of year and that they borrow from each other, that's how religions are. They change over time, they influence each other, they borrow from each other. I have a really cute book here, right here, called Holly, Reindeer and Colored Lights, which was done in 1981, and it has been re-released. And it turns out that the woman who did it's two women. They did one about Easter, and I believe one about another major Halloween. And what this is it goes through and it tells you about every single one of the Christmas symbols and all the various ways that it came to be.
That's
And they
cool.
don't say they stole them, they just say these were around, they were part of the culture at large, and they
Mm.
got subsumed into Christian. It wasn't until like the 7th century Saint Pope Gregory who deliberately said we should adapt, take the pagan holidays and make them into Christian holidays. So that's quite late,
Mm.
6th century. But so the whole thing about what we particularly do, and I heard one guy who's clearly a Norse aficionado, and I liked him. You got to be careful about those guys because some of them are just white supremacist jerks, but
Sure.
there are quite a few of them who are very interesting. And this guy was saying instead of getting mad at Christianity, we might want to realize that if it hadn't been for Christianity, some of the Yule's holiday things would have died out entirely
Mm.
because they got enfolded into Christian practice.
Mm.
We still know about them because they were continued. So that's kind of a neat thing. So if you want to know about all of them, like why Christmas trees, what's by the way, Yule logs, no offense to Bridget, who's making us one, Yule logs do not hear about in the literature until the 17th century.
Mm.
That's really recent. Like,
Mm.
and that's long after Christianity. But so anyway, we got it for the kids. Ostensibly, they're written for kids, but any adult could certainly appreciate this. So it talks about why mistletoe, why reindeer, why the three kings, why. It's
Mm. That's
it's
cool.
pretty cool,
Because
and it's not
to your point, Mary
ideological.
Kay, like Christmas wasn't observed like immediately after Christ died.
Right,
It took
exactly.
it took I don't know, like 300, 400 years or something like that. Like it.
Right. Well, and I don't have dates on this, but it turns out because I watched two very lengthy discussions. There's a guy who does a thing called Religion for Breakfast, and he's a PhD religious studies person, and he's really good, very accessible. So anything you want to know about the religions of the world, he has a whole thing on the Baha'i and a whole thing on um, just various groups. I
Yeah.
watched one about Hanukkah and so forth. And he knows what he's talking about, but he's accessible. And he was saying the reason Christmas is on the 25th is not because Saturnalia was, or Sol Invictus, which was the other holiday celebrated by the Romans at that time, which was clearly a
Yeah.
solstice
The solstice.
celebration.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was a very minor holiday.
Mm.
What was big was Saturnalia. Nobody cared much about Sol Invictus, which is kind of a side thing. But Saturnalia was a huge deal. So he said, rather than the Christians wanted to be at the same time as Saturnalia, why would they? I mean, Saturnalia stands for everything the Christians would have disliked, because it was way too celebratory and about eating and doing stuff that the Christians were sort of opposed to. What they did care about was having Jesus's birth occur on the winter solstice.
Mm.
That's what they wanted because they put his death and um uh his death on the equinox and his birth on the solstice. And they did that on purpose, or right around the equinox. They did that on purpose. That we have lots of data for. Like, we can really argue that from written data.
Mm,
And so the question would be, once again, what is this obsession with the solstices and equinoxes?
right.
Well, I would say that for the Christians, it's because it's old. I mean, everybody does it. The Romans did it, the Norse did it, the Celts did it, everybody's holidays fall, except for the Chinese. I was just looking at the Chinese things, and it's very interesting, but part of that's because they're lunar. They follow largely a lunar
Right.
cycle. Ditto Jews follow a lunar cycle, and of course the things that we're used to, solstice, equinox, that's a solar system.
Mm, mm,
And so that's why Jews seem to have their holidays in places that don't fully, compute with Gentiles, but it's because of the lunarness. And I would say that's true of the Chinese too. But when you look at the Chinese, they do, by the way, in China, celebrate the solstices and equinoxes. They
mm.
do. And they do have holidays for, like parties and so forth. But their big holidays that have names are not
Right.
those four. Um, so in any case, the Christians picked the 25th because it was near the solstice, and they
Mm,
wanted Jesus to be born on an important day. And plus, they were all astrologers. I'm listening to a very, very interesting. If anybody's interested, this guy's name is Justin Sledge, and he runs a thing on YouTube called Esoterica. You have to put his name in or you'll get some weird stuff. But he also is a PhD religious studies person. And one of the things I've really come away understanding is, if you think that Christians were not involved in magical practice,
mm.
then you're just foolish. They were deeply involved in it, and deeply involved in magical practice, in astrology, all of that. So the idea that somehow there was astrology was over here and Christianity was over here is just untrue. The
Mm.
Christians were very well aware of astrology. They had mixed feelings about it. That's true, because it was quote unquote pagan. But they were deeply involved in it. So the Christians absolutely would have known about the solstices and equinoxes and wanted to have their important holidays on those days.
Hmm.
So, as you say, it isn't like Jesus died and then they said, oh, let's have a birthday party. We'll
Right.
do it on December 25th. As my mom used to say, I thought that the shepherds were in the fields because it was lambing season. I don't think lambing season happens in the winter, right? No, that would be Imbolc, actually, at least in the so-called pagan wheel of the year. That'd be Imbolc, which is in February. So
Mm,
anyway, so that's the thing is, just Christmas comes at that time of year because everything does.
hmm.
Even Jews have Hanukkah. Now, it's not a terribly deeply important holiday to them, although it has become so, kind of in contradistinction to
Right.
Christmas, which is a thing about religions, is that they evolve over time, that they're very diverse internally, and that they are interactive with the other religions around them. That
Mm,
these are three principles that religious studies people who are serious will repeat again and again: that religions change over time, they are diverse internally, and they interact with the culture around them. So Christianity certainly did do that. And lucky for us, because Christianity could at times be awfully austere. So if they hadn't taken on some of this Yule stuff, we wouldn't get to eat, drink, and be merry.
yeah, I think that's a good point. I sometimes, like, I think when we talk about some more, you know, rural type, if we could say that, or
Yeah,
type
yeah,
celebrations, or things that predate modern religion, because they are modern, right? Like
yeah.
that, we poo-poo on the modern religions because of their, I don't know how to put it, like, I don't want to say it negatively, but parasitic nature. It's true.
Yeah, right.
And maybe that's not necessarily a religion itself, but because it's being manifested through, I guess, power hungry humans, that it's a conquest, and it's turning, and it's broadcasting out, this is not me, so therefore it's bad, or whatever. But that we forget that in their conquest, they do, and as they absorb, the threads of what they're taking in is also being encapsulated and preserved at the same time.
That's true. And also, I think, and again, I'm kind of speaking to myself here. We tend to see Christianity as this very bellicose, aggressive, um, imperialist, culturally devastating influence.
Yeah.
I see it that way. I mean,
Yeah.
the native people up in Canada are suffering to this very minute.
Yeah.
So, and many people in the world are. However, that Christianity is quite late. That is to say, when that really gets started in a big way is under Constantine. It's when Christianity is married to the Roman Empire that becomes true. True, very true. Before that, there are an awful lot of kinds of Christians. Like we have this idea that there was a true Christianity, which then broke apart into a lot of types. That is inaccurate. There were a lot of types of Christianity. Some of them got wiped out over time, particularly under this Romanization influence. But initially, people weren't in agreement about whether Jesus was God, whether he'd risen from the dead, what exactly his message was. Did you have to be a Jew? That was all completely under contention. So the idea that you and I are kind of operating out of, which is this very strong, aggressive, militaristic religion, it takes a while for that to develop. And in the meantime, people didn't just drop everything they'd been doing because they didn't necessarily see it as contradictions
Right.
to their Christianity. So they wouldn't have necessarily thought you couldn't have a winter solstice celebration and be a Christian at the same time. I think that kind of ideological brutality and rigidity develops over time, as do I'm sorry, but Buddhism's got a pretty dark history in some places. And we think of Buddhism as this, love and light religion, but go talk to the Mongolians and the Tibetans. That was not the historical experience of those people. There have been Buddhist king warriors who, now, was it as bad as Christianity? No, of course not. But it has it's when religions become linked to militarism and the state and state control that you cease to be looking at what's the nature of reality, what's my place in it, how am I supposed to act, these are the perennial questions of all religions. And then it starts to become, how can the king better control his subjects?
Right.
Right. So so that's the thing, is that Christianity probably adapted things over time, initially relatively spontaneously, and then eventually it became part of the dogma of the church. Of, if you want to convince the pagans, then try to use what you can in that kind of cynical, what we would see as being kind of cynical.
Well, it's sort of like the yin yang symbol, right? Even
Yeah.
at the peak of one, there's still the seed of the other based within it, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so,
Well, when I was in Ireland, I went to a workshop, and the woman giving it said the most interesting thing. She said, Ireland was a pagan country until the Protestant Reformation. And what she meant was Catholicism is an extremely pagan form of Christianity.
sure.
It is, and it has remained so. We have Mexican relatives. Let me tell you that their form, and I was in Mexico and I went into churches and there was chicken blood on the altar in Roman Catholic churches. So the sort of syncretic, I think they call it, when you blend things together, that is ongoing. And yes, now I'm going to be a little biased here. So I admit that, but it's the Protestant Reformation that becomes this absolutely, utterly my way or the highway. I mean, just so you know, more witches were burned during the Protestant Reformation than had been burned before. Heretics were burned before, but witches was not the main thing. Yes, the Catholic Church, Maleficarum, and yada, yada, yada. I'm not saying they didn't burn witches, but their main thing was heretics. So, and a lot of the Protestant Reformation is about trying to stamp out the quote unquote pagan, namely rural, folk traditions out of Catholicism. That's a huge part of the Protestant, particularly in the higher, quote unquote, higher versions like the Anglican Church. Queen Elizabeth was obsessed with wiping out things that she saw as pagan, like astrology and roadside diviners and people like that. I mean, they would flog them when they found them and stuff. So now she also thought that the Catholics were plotting against her, which they were, so that's fair. But then she was plotting against them too. So
well, that I mean, I think that just goes to highlight the unique time period that we're living in, right?
yes,
That
yes,
not only can we find out things, we can talk about them without the fear of being beheaded, castrated,
right.
ostracized, you know, like,
Unless you live in Iran, apparently.
well, then yeah,
They're going to execute that soccer player, the one who supported the demonstrations. I'm hoping there'll be a huge hue and cry about it because he's a famous, big, important soccer player. He's played in international games. Yesterday, I thought, I don't say very much good about the United States, but I will right now. Is that we could go out and protest, and as my friend said, it was actually Aaron. He said, "Well." I said, they don't execute people here. And I said, well, that's not exactly true. People have been executed here.
right,
But it isn't the policy that's spoken out loud that we execute people. And when people find out about it, mostly they're upset by that, right?
Generally speaking.
Anyway, but yes, you're right. We have access to information. We get to make choices, which is pretty cool, pretty nice. Anyway, back to Yule.
Yeah.
What else about Yule?
So I think maybe just a little bit on, maybe we just put a bow on it, like in terms of some.
Well, let's talk about this business of the obsession with the solstices, shall we?
Yeah.
So I've been looking at this in more detail because it's a thing that there's a Netflix special on called the Ancient Apocalypse. And the guy who did it is very controversial. He is not an anthropologist. The anthropologists hate him. But he has been looking at these issues for 30 years. You have to give him credit for tenacity. He raises some very interesting issues. I don't suggest people buy it hook, line, and sinker. But it's interesting what he's talking about. So give it a look. I thought it was interesting. And plus, I like people who are willing to ask the questions that nobody wants to say out loud. So here's a question. Newgrange, which I like to talk about instead of Stonehenge, because why? Because it's older than Stonehenge, and it's in Ireland. And when the Celts got to Ireland, Newgrange had already been sitting there for 2,200 years.
Wow.
That's a long time. The Newgrange is older than Stonehenge and older than the pyramids. It is not the oldest archaeoastronomy thing, but it is one of the oldest. So it's about 5,000 years old. And I've been to it. It's pretty cool. That it was built such that the winter solstice sun comes in what looks like a transom over the door, and it's built so it goes down into, as you're walking in, you're going down slightly so that the sun at this winter solstice comes in and hits this stone in the middle of the main chamber, right in the middle of it for 2 or 3 days. And it's people are so interested by it that you have to be part of a lottery to actually be allowed to see it, because you have to be in the chamber. So, tens of thousands of people try to get in, and 50 get to be in or something. And as they said when I was there, it has the dubious distinction of being the only structure in Ireland that has never leaked. It was built in such a way, it's got this internal chamber where the rocks are set up in circles above you to make a dome, and they're set up, and these are not tiny rocks. These are those big, megalithic, monstrous rocks, and they're set such that water has never gotten in there in 5,000 years. It's literally the only place in Ireland's never leaked. So that is a solstice marker. But they are, as I say, all over the world. And we have to ask ourselves this question. Do you really want me to think that guys who were hoeing with rocks tied to sticks built that?
Right.
Because it takes massive amounts of engineering skill,
Right.
mathematical skill, and astronomical skill. This we're talking about an engineering feat that I'm not sure we could do right now. And I actually heard a guy years ago say, I'm not sure we could build the pyramids right now. That's how engineering, they're a quarter of an inch off at the base, the pyramids. That's insanely precise. So I'm not saying it was spaceships, so don't everybody panic here. I have no idea what the answer to that question
Right.
is. The question would be, how in the hell did a bunch of Neolithic farmers who, do not want to do work like that? I don't even think Ireland had a population that could have supported that level of work. But putting that aside, why would they do it? Now,
Right.
people say they needed to know when to plant their crops. Hun, I marked out the directions on my land in Canada. They're very precise. Brian's brother was there. He's an engineer. He helped me get them to be extremely precise. On the north, south, east, west directions, I put poles in the ground, and on the cross quarters, I put trees. You don't have to build Stonehenge to
Right.
mark where the solstice is going to be. You
Right.
can put a stick in the ground. And in fact, we have wood henges, the remnants of them all over the world. So people did, in fact, do that. People may have planted trees, but they have died and we don't know about them anymore. So I'm not saying people didn't do simple things. I'm sure they did. The question would be, what in God's name would motivate you to build Stonehenge?
Right.
Right? I mean, it's not a grave. Newgrange at least had some bodies in it. Now, I think they were put there post facto, but that's okay. It was clearly not just for graves. It was something else. And I don't know the answer to that question, but this fellow, who's Graham Norton, is his name Graham Norton? Anyway, the ancient apocalypse guy, he's willing to ask
Graham
those
Hancock.
questions. What?
Graham Hancock.
Hancock, correct. Sorry. He's willing to ask those questions. Anthropologists, they're worried about their careers. They don't want to step out of line. And
Right.
he doesn't care. He's like, let's just ask about this.
Right.
And I don't know how they got built. And I am not saying people came from outer space and did it. But I am asking the question, as is he, why in God's name were people so obsessed with this issue that they would go to the kinds of trouble and develop the kinds of skills needed to build some of these things that are still extant?
Right.
I don't know what the answer to that is, but I'll tell you what, it did not have to do with knowing when to plant your crops.
Right.
That's dumb. Farmers can go like this and hold their finger up and tell you when to plant their crops by the way the air is moving. I met a German guy who was a biodynamic farmer. He used to taste the soil. He knew. That's farmers know shit. We had almanacs. We didn't need to build
Correct.
right. We didn't build Stonehenge. So I don't know what the answer to that is, but there's something. So that's a weird question. And it carries on in this folk tradition of everywhere in the world, people recognize these. And again, that could just be experiential because we see it and we, the sun is doing funny stuff and we're watching it and so forth. And we did understand in ancient times how important the sun was to us. And I might throw out that the sun was thought of as a living being that had, in animistic principles would have said that the sun was a living creature that was worthy of some sort of acknowledgement.
Right.
So that's just the question. Everybody can go off and ponder that, come up with whatever answer they think they have. But I'll tell you what, it wasn't because the farmers needed to know when to plant their crops. That's dumb. That's a stupid explanation. You could do that with some sticks. Sure. So it's clearly a very ancient concern, given that we have these archaeological sites that are thousands of years old that are about this same issue that we're about to celebrate. Hopefully after they built Stonehenge, they remembered to eat, drink, and be merry. Because if anybody wanted to celebrate, I think it'd be them.
Well, I think, from almost all times, all societies, civilizations, they build things that that they're forced to do, number one.
Well,
But
that's true.
right, so but
That's a whole other issue.
yeah, yeah. We're not going to be remiss and not mention that. But they build things to their beliefs, right, that are generally greater than the sum of an individual's labor,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And simultaneously, like if we look at it on a micro level, what a person would be willing to do to save their daughter, son, child, nephew, whatever.
Right.
There's all kinds of stories of people doing sort of superhuman feats in order to save somebody else. Again, the effort extends beyond one's own normal amount of work they could be able to do. When you
Right.
view yourself as a part of something larger, or it's greater than you, like I said. And this is absolutely part of that thing. How engineering wise, how it was done, no one, I don't know how we'll know. I don't,
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting as they are able to find more and more sites to see if they can come up with any, at least hypotheses about it. But no, you're right. People do crazy. I mean, they built cathedrals, they did all that stuff, right? And those societies tend to be very hierarchical. And as you say, people doing the work are not always doing it voluntarily.
Right.
We don't have any evidence of that at Newgrange. That's what's funny. There might have been chieftains, right? But chieftains can't marshal that much labor.
Right.
You're talking about a pharaoh or a king who's got an army and so forth that can marshal hundreds of people to do things they don't necessarily want to do.
Mhm.
Um, so perhaps it's just that people were always marking out the solstice directions and all that, but they did it in ways that have disappeared, so we
Right.
don't know about them. And then as societies got more hierarchical and more religiously highfalutin, as I like to say, ornate,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
did it in a bigger way. Part of why I keep harping back to Newgrange is it doesn't seem to fit that model. It's not, as far as we know, it did not have a huge population. In Ireland today has 5 million people.
Mm.
And at its height, it had 8 million people. So we can assume that during the Neolithic period, it
It
didn't
wasn't.
have
Yeah.
anything like that.
Yeah.
Plus, there was no pharaonic, kingly
Sure.
anything.
Sure.
Not 5,000 years ago. So that's why it's a very odd one. Whereas
Your
something like
takeaway,
Egypt is not so odd.
but your takeaway point is that like there was this, essentially love of the sun.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and that's the love of the sun, the love of the adoration, admiration of the thing that they are so, not obsessed with but focused on is
Right.
coming back.
Right.
Right. And so
Right.
this is the, reason for celebration. This is
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that because I was trying to put myself in the mindset, and I think that even those of us who tend to be animistic and think that things are alive,
Mm.
it's not the same as living in a culture where it's taken as a given. It
Right.
isn't. You and I know that our belief about that is in contradistinction to the hegemonic belief, which
Yeah.
is that the material world is inanimate.
Right.
That is the modern belief. And we have to go up against that
Right.
so we are not in a context where that is just taken as a given.
Mm.
And with it is taken the given. I wrote it down actually. In days gone by, anthropologists and historians defined animism as everything is living. And now religious studies people define it as everything is living and has spirit. That's the old definition. The new one, which I quite like, is that reality is full of persons, only some of which are human, but all of which are deserving of respect.
Mm.
The key concept being respect. Also, animism sees human persons as entangled within these networks of non-human persons. That is a much better definition of animism.
Sure.
Because it sees that this feeling that we can't survive without the sun is not an ideological thing. It's like a felt experience. It's
Sure.
like when you've done a journey and you've actually interacted with a thing that is considered to be inanimate
Right.
in this culture, it changes you. I mean,
Yeah.
I always say to people, you don't know what rocks are until you've talked to one,
Right.
because that changes your whole feeling about what these so-called things are. And so if you live in a culture where the sun is a being, then it's not just any old being, it's a being that is in some sense your um progenitor, your
Right.
being who keeps you here. Then the idea that you would go to some amount of lengths to be respectful and to not be acknowledging is less
Mm.
mysterious, I would say.
Well, that's sort of like the implementation of biological materialism on society, right? That when the lights go out for you, you're is a bag of bones until some bacteria eats you up, you know,
Right,
and
right.
that your lights on the inside are you're
Yeah,
sort of done.
right.
Um, you know,
And
which we
these,
obviously we have plenty of episodes on this, you know, the YOLO episodes, the biological materialistic episodes, all the episodes that we've just done recently on the Buddhist version or Buddhist idea of the soul and pre-life, post-life, afterlife, enlightenment, all these
right.
kinds of things. So we talk about this all the time. So this
I'll
is,
bet. I have
you
no
know,
doubt. And by the way, I don't mean to be dunking on Buddhism. I'm just
oh
I
no.
I only used it as an example because we don't tend to think of Buddhism as anything except kind of peaceful and lovely. You know what
Well,
I mean?
that's I mean the whole thing is recency bias, right? That's
Yeah,
everything is recency bias. And
yeah,
to, you know, before we started recording, you were talking about, you know, yourself as a historian, right?
yeah,
And that like the acquisition of information prior to, I don't want to call it like modern pruning, you
yeah.
know,
Right.
but it is, shows the vast difference of how things could have been or were, right?
Yeah,
We're not really quite sure on how much what percent one was, but
yeah,
it does show a vast difference between how we are viewing ourselves as society. We just, I don't know how, I don't know how everybody thinks, but I know in my mind before I started, you know, doing this, I just figured that it was like what I saw in movies and, you know, kind of an older version of what we have now. So we had homes and we had whatever, and they were just shittier. There wasn't a president, there was a king, and there was local war, you
right.
know, whatever my ignorant, you know, view of things was, maybe some aspects of truth, but how else would I have any frame of reference? But the beliefs that people held and how those beliefs not only were ingrained in society, but actually were the society itself
Yeah, yeah,
is vastly different than what we have now. Our beliefs now are an aspect of society,
yeah,
but not necessarily the driving force. Our reliance on each other now is more than it's ever been, which is great. But then our reliance on finances and everything else is also not so great for various reasons. But this is a much larger topic conversation that, you know, I don't want to, doesn't relate to what we're talking about
yeah,
specifically, but it does show that the difference, you know, the
yeah.
vast difference in how we view things now versus how things were viewed before. I'm not comparing or contrasting, I'm just saying like it's vast, you know.
It's very, and I think because I was trained in anthropology, that somebody said to me the other day, it's culture. And I said, well, actually, it isn't, because if you're aware of it, it's not culture. And that's a little bit of an overstatement, especially now to modern people. But culture is that which you are unaware of.
Mm,
It's that which is just taken as a given.
right.
It's what people like to call common sense, which is a great anthropological article called "Common Sense is Not Common." But so so I think it's, and anyone who's a trained historian knows this. You can't know what the reality of people in the past was. You
Right.
can't. You
Right.
can read about it because it was much too complex, much too vast. And plus, you have to be in a context and actually be the people in that context. So
Mm,
you have to take as a given certain kinds of ideas about the world that you can't take as given anymore
right.
because they aren't given. And so we can't really know that. And that's part of what I like about journeying, because I feel like journeying gives me the closest possibility which by the way is a hint about what I would like to do at the Yule celebration, it gives me the biggest possibility of actually experiencing the other
Right.
stuff that I can't experience.
Right.
And so I said when I first started doing shamanic stuff that I wanted to do it so I could talk to historic figures, to people long
Right.
gone, and ask what their experience was. And what was funny was that I've only actually talked directly to one or two people who, by the way, said things that were utterly shocking to me, which was cool. But it turned out I didn't talk to people. I was in their realities, watching them live, almost like an anthropologist would be.
Mm,
And that was pretty cool too.
nice.
So yeah, it's hard to know. And a lot of people who talk about Yule, just bring it back to Yule,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
online, who are decent. And I'm going to mention one in a minute that people might want to look up. They say that. They say, for instance, it was a part of Yule to slaughter animals and sprinkle the blood all over the participants. It had to do with blood, which represents life, and 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 so it was not gross or icky. But clearly we aren't going to do that now,
Right.
because it would be icky and we would think it was gross. And this one guy said, so I think we can forgo the blood sprinkling part of Yule.
Right.
However, perhaps not the ale drinking part of Yule.
Right. We can
So
keep that.
his idea, let's take what makes sense to us in this context and what we can get behind and what feels like it makes sense to us.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to do: eat, drink, and be merry.
I love it. I love it. Well, Mary Kay, I think that's a really great place to
Yep.
hit it right there.
Yep.
Thanks for coming on and chatting today.
Yep. And I will see
I
you
really
soon.
enjoyed it. I think it's apropos given this time of year.
Yes.
So this was, also another reason why, we wanted to do this today. And so I hope that people enjoyed this conversation and, what came out of it. I think it's interesting. It doesn't really get talked about so readily, right? You kind of have to do a little research and it's there. The information is there, obviously.
The guy I wanted to mention, his
Yeah.
name is Rune. That's his actual name. It's not something he made up. He's from Sweden, Rune Rasmussen, and
Okay.
he has a thing called Nordic animism. That's his channel. And
Okay.
he also is a PhD comparative religious studies guy, but he's very interested in looking at Norse mythology, and he has things on Yule and Santa Claus. Is Santa Claus Odin and so forth?
Okay.
And what I like about him is very anti-racist, because you've got to be awful careful. You try to go after Norse mythology and you're going to run into white supremacist Nazis very
Sure.
quickly.
Sure.
So he's really cool, and he also knows a lot about Caribbean religions, which I do also. So I like him.
Nice.
So if you want to hear more about the Norse ideas of Yule,
Yeah.
you might go on to his YouTube station.
Okay. That sounds great. Well, Mary
All
Kay,
right, darling.
thank you for coming on.
Lovely
Thank you,
to talk
everybody.
to you.
Thanks everybody for tuning in, whether you're watching us on YouTube or listening to us on some podcast platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it is that people are listening to us. Thank you so much. If you found our content useful, please, subscribe, share, all that other kind of stuff. If you would like to, holler at us for any reason, if you want to ask Mary Kay a question or whatever, or myself or anything, email me at ginandtantra@gmail.com. You can also hit us up on Instagram at Gin and Tantra, or just leave a comment in the YouTube section. We definitely, we read those and all that. If you're on Apple Podcasts, leave us a review. It helps the show. We definitely appreciate all the organic growth that is out there for all of our, listeners to help us with. I hope everybody has a wonderful Yule celebration or winter solstice or whatever it is that you observe.
Kwanzaa's nice.
Kwanzaa, Hanukkah,
Mention. Yep.
Christmas, all of the things, whatever it is, celebrate it, drink a lot, eat a lot,
drink, be merry.
Yeah, and give. That's the one.
And give. Be generous. Be generous.
Be generous. It's okay. And if you don't have money, then give your time. And if you don't have time or you don't have money, then just give smiles like that. That's always useful.
Be nice. That'd be
nice,
good.
Right? Be merry. There you go. That's the
be merry. Exactly.
There you go. Well, anyways, this is Daniel. That was Mary Kay. Thanks for being here on Gin and Tantra. We'll catch everybody in the next one. Peace.
So long, buddy.